think a lot about how to get folks here, and we're so glad you're here today. I also want to add that we have some student program assistants who are training and recording our conversation this morning. So please, if you don't want to be videoed, just kind of stay behind them and you'll be fine. Our speaker today is going to speak about this exhibition, it's called Cracking the Cosmic Code, Medieval Numerology and Medieval Art. And Beth Fischer is our Assistant Curator of Digital Research and Learning, and she's going to share more about herself, but I'll just add that she's been working here for 5 years with our collection of medieval work. She's a medievalist and has been studying medieval art for over 20 years, so you're really in for a treat today. And we're going to have Beth talking for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So as she's talking, please hold on to your questions, get them in your brain, get ready to ask Beth anything you want because she's excellent at answering questions. Beth?
Yeah, and there's so much that I'm not talking about today that I'm happy to talk about. So, happy to answer questions about the medieval collection or Wickham more generally at the end. So as Roz said, I'm Beth Fischer. Thanks all for being here today. I'm actually an alumna of Williams College. I wrote my very first art history paper in the early 2000s on a work that was in that corner at that time, a medieval work. And that was when I stopped being a classicist and started being an art historian and went on to specialize in medieval art. And then somehow ended up back here. It happens to alums. So today I'm talking about cracking the cosmic code. And the first thing I'm going to say is, why are we calling it cracking the cosmic code? And that's because numbers are really important in medieval art, but the way that they're important often seems convoluted to us. They really were looking for experiences where they felt like they were uncovering a mystery. Repeated exposure to images, having to do calculations on the numbers they were seeing, finding multiple meanings out of the same numbers. This was all sort of part of the game of reading images. And it's important to think about that idea of reading images because the way they thought about what images should do was as a book for the illiterate and a way of understanding very, very complex thinking. We encounter so many images that we're just not quite accustomed to that expectation, that an ordinary person would look at something and start counting the details and trying to find patterns, and that would be part of how they interacted with a work of art. So that's why we titled it Cracking the Cosmic Code, because really it was seen as, how can we uncover the mysteries of the universe? It's a big order. We'll see a lot of ways they tried to do it. Roz said, hold your questions to the end. I would say if you need me to repeat anything, tell me right away. I'm happy to do that. This room can be very echoey. If you look around, you'll notice that it's a little different than most of our galleries, and that's because it was designed as a replica of a Spanish medieval hall. This panel in the corner far behind you, I'm not going to actually talk about today, but it's the sort of paneling that would have hung on a room like this with these tiles and the leaded windows and the beams. So this room is almost always installed with works of medieval art, but what we show changes as we move around. So this has long been a specialty of the college, and we're thinking about what does that look like in the 21st century? How do we want to be thinking about that? I'm going to start off by talking about these two works over here. Feel free to get closer. As I said, people would have been looking closely at a lot of these. In particular, these two would have been seen fairly close up. The one on the left is called a desco di parto. That's Italian for just a birthing tray. And what these were ceremonial gifts that were given to women shortly after they had given birth, usually by their husband or a close family member. Often they would be double-sided. This one may have had a back, but it doesn't anymore. They would be used to ceremonially give the woman her first meal after giving birth, and then often hung on the wall. We actually know that Lorenzo de' Medici had the one that had been given to his mother hanging on his wall when he died. They were popular in Florence for a very short period of time, only a couple decades, and we have a lot of them. And they often have mythological scenes that were intended to be interpreted allegorically. In this case, what we have is a scene of Diana and Actaeon. Does anyone know that story? Is that familiar to folks? Sometimes I find that students have heard about it in classes. The story goes that Actaeon, who is a prince, he's right over here, goes hunting. And we're not really sure how intentional it was that he ends up basically hunting for Diana and finding her naked and bathing in the woods. Might be an accident, might have been, youthful bad intentions. We're not really sure. He gets punished, as you might guess. And he gets punished by being turned into a stag. This is him over here with his antlers coming out and getting torn apart by his own hunting dogs. Now, you may be thinking, why on earth would someone give this to a woman right after she's given birth? Well, Diana has this really interesting role in early 15th century Florence, where she is both a goddess of chastity and she is a goddess of fertility. Kind of interesting things to hold together. And one of the things that numbers do in this painting is show us how the fertility side is emphasized. There are a lot of 12s going on here. The 12-sided panel is actually fairly unusual. Most of these trays would have been round. The bath has 12 sides, with some fancy filigree added. This is because Diana was the goddess of the moon and gets associated with months and gets associated with menstruation, right? Menstruation coming from months. And so she becomes the goddess of fertility through that. That fertility symbolism is expanded when you start seeing that the number of people she has with her, there are these 7 women, and those are the 7 sisters, also known as the Pleiades, and they were associated also with both chastity and fertility. So we get this very doubling of that messaging. So it becomes this great gift to give a woman, you had my son, and I'm pretty confident he's mine, right? So it's both of those things, great heir. And we get that mainly when we start thinking about the numbers that tell us that it isn't just this mythological story, that it's a message about the woman as becoming like Diana. I'm pairing it with this one right here. This is a Dormition panel. It's only about 30 years later, but it is made in Germany. This one also has a woman at the center of it, but she's in a very different sort of framework. This is what's called the Dormition of Mary. It's a fancy way to say the death of Mary, a going to sleep of the Virgin Mary. This would have been after the ascension of Christ. She's quite old and she is dying, and the disciples come to her bedside. These would have been the followers of Jesus, the first followers. This panel would have been used in a church, but quite close up. One thing I love about this, and something you should get close enough to see, is that this candlestick right here in front, this sort of weird vessel with the prong on it, those of you who are close up, can you see anything funny going on right above that?
Oh, it's got burn marks.
It's got burn marks, exactly. Yeah, there's some staining right above it because a candle actually was probably placed on that. There are a lot of images from this time that show a candle by her bedside as sort of a part of the ritual process of a death. And here we get this combination of the depicted pictorial space and the real candle. And this would have been something that people were seeing as they were doing similar rituals, with candles, with books, reading the prayers, right? We see those. This vessel right here is a censer for putting incense onto things. There's also a water vessel for holy water there. So we see sort of them doing this ritual in a space where people were contributing to that. And has anyone counted? You probably haven't yet, but I hope that by the end you'll start counting immediately the number of people who are here with Mary.
9.
So we've got, there's a couple, there are a couple down here too. So we've got this block of 6 up here, 7, 8, 9, then there's 10, 11, and this is actually a person here too as well, that probably this side you can really see it on. So we have 12. Now, if you've done any work, you're like, oh yeah, no big deal, 12 disciples. That comes out of 12 tribes of Israel. There's a lot of talk about 12. But the funny thing is the stories about this always said there were 11. It was actually a major plot point in Stories of Mary's Dormition that there were 11 and one of them doesn't get there on time. It's a really big deal how he doesn't get there on time. What this artist has done is put all 12 there. And there's an important reason for that. That's because the idea of the 12, of the complete group performing the ritual, was so important in monastic communities after that time. Saint Benedict, who founds the first monasteries, actually writes that you should have 12 monasteries and they should each have 12 monks to start out. So this idea of 12 being the right number of people to perform a ritual really sticks, and they override the story to make that point. So we have 12 here in both cases being used in really, really different ways, but where having that context, knowing the stories that were told and the context in which they were used tells you why those numbers matter. We're gonna come over here next to these paintings on the wall. These three paintings were not originally hung together, but the two on the right and left, as I hope you can see, were originally associated. We have the same floor, the same decorations. All three of these, though, come from larger sets of paintings of saints, and these would have been hung around churches all over Europe, all through the Middle Ages. These are from slightly different periods and places, but this is a really common thing to do, to hang a whole bunch of paintings of saints together to form part of your community in a church. We have here in the middle St. Lucy. There's a great story that I don't have time to tell today about how we found out that this was St. Lucy. It was actually overpainted for a while as St. Cecilia. But it is St. Lucy. She has her eyes on a platter. Another story of interest. So she's a martyr saint, so killed and turned into a saint for her Christian faith. The other two are also martyr saints. St. Sebastian is on the right, with the arrows hanging from his hand that were used to kill him. Over here is a less familiar one. This is St. Fabian. He was a pope who became saint. He primarily became a saint because he had refused to become pope. So it was one of those like humility shows you're worthy kinds of stories. Why we have them in a numerology exhibition is because there was a way that numbers got associated with gender. And it's not quite as simple as saying, well, if you see a 2, it means it's a woman, and if you see 3, it means it's a man. It was more that even numbers were associated with femininity and feminine aspects of things, and odd numbers were associated with male aspects or masculinity. So when you see warrior saints like Saint Joan of Arc, she would often be depicted with odd numbers because she was sort of acting in a masculine role. So we can't go into it and say every time you see a 2 or a 3, often they get overridden by other things, right? We just talked about why 12, there's probably more important stuff going on. 3, it's often the Trinity and not about masculinity. But these are really good examples because what you have here are some choices that are made around it. We have St. Sebastian being shown with 3 arrows. We have this very lovely papal tiara here. This is, that really emphasizes why you might turn down being pope as a way of showing humility, because you get this kind of fancy stuff when you do it. It's made entirely of 3s and 5s set in a pyramid. And this is part of why odd numbers get associated with masculinity. Those are seen as being strong numbers because they form pyramids, and pyramids are very solid. Where these 2s on the sides of St. Lucy, the archways, are more associated with weakness in construction. A lot of this is going to come out in architecture, and we'll talk about architecture a couple of other times, but a lot of this numerology gets written about in architectural treatises, where you talk about the strength of a building and that being a sign of its spiritual value. So practical notes get turned into spiritual interpretations. I also wanted to say about these two that you have an important reason for St. Sebastian and St. Fabian to be hung together that has to do with numbers. And this is the calendrical side of numerology in the medieval period. Originally, they never would have been hung together at all. And I told you that St. Fabian became a saint for humility. They, however, happened to die on the same day, very different years, but on the same day, and were celebrated in the church on the same day in January. Now, medieval people said, that can't be an accident. That has to mean something. And they started pairing them and looking for reasons to pair them. And it turns out that one of the things that St. Fabian had was a moment when he was imprisoned and was tortured with an agricultural rake. That's this business right up here in the front. So they would have used that to scrape his skin. These become popular saints during the plague, and they both get associated with the pain of plague. And so St. Fabian becomes a plague saint because of dying on the same day as a saint that's already associated with a plague. Right? So again, looking for meaning. This can't be chance, so we need to find a reason for this to happen and understand, why do bad things happen to people? how does the world work? So when you're looking for patterns, you start finding them everywhere. From there, we're going to move on over to this far corner. And again, please tell me if you can't hear me or if I'm moving too fast. There are a lot of details here, and especially those of you who are further away from them, take a moment and look up close, because they really benefit from the kind of prolonged study that their original viewers would have had the opportunity to do. So, another saint associated with suffering. We're going to see a little bit of a theme here. This wall is almost all about sort of who can you pray to for all of your problems. You may have heard of St. Anthony Abbot before, but probably only in the context of medical ailments, because St. Anthony's fire is still used as the term to refer to certain kinds of skin diseases that feel like they're burning. We see some of this fire here. St. Anthony was an early saint in Egypt. He was one of the first hermits, so went out into the desert to live like an ascetic life all by himself. You wouldn't know that from the background. This background was probably intended to make it look like he was in the space where this was originally hung. So the background is less about showing what it looked like in his original time and more about making him part of the living community. We can also see that because he's not dressed like a late antique era Egyptian hermit, right? He is dressed like he's in the 15th century, absolutely. This isn't because they didn't know that people wore different clothes in the past. This was all about using this figure as a model for their daily life in the present. And we can see that in a lot of other ways too. The clothing is more contemporary, the interior is more contemporary. This book that he is holding out actually mentions him, right? This is a part of a prayer to St. Anthony. If you get close enough, you can see that the third line, it says Antonius, and you can also see some other things. This right here, where there's a missing part, would have been ignem, fire, and extinguere. So like, St. Anthony, please help me extinguish this fire. That can mean either the fire of temptation or these skin ailments that we're talking about here. He's holding a bell to chase away the bad spirits. He has an inkwell and a penknife, but perhaps most importantly, for our purposes today anyway, he has this coming down the side. Does anyone recognize what that is? Does that look, this string of beads, does that look familiar to anyone? I think you know. Yeah, right. It is an early version of a rosary. So if you haven't heard of a rosary before, it's a string of beads. They're commonly used in the Catholic faith, but they've been used in many faiths to keep track of counting prayers. Now, rosaries don't really get popular until about the 12th century. They reach their peak at about the time that this painting was made, and they have a lot of forms early on. Each of those forms points to a specific set of prayers. So now they're most commonly set up in groups of 10, often with a bead in between. But at the time, men usually had these ones that weren't circles, they were strings. We'll actually see that in that one over on the corner as well. And different numbers would refer to different sets of prayers. I'm not going to make you count them because the light brown on the dark brown is probably hard to see from where you all are, but it's 13. And this was a really common number at the time because it was 12 plus 1, right? If we go back to 12, it's the 12 disciples plus 1 for Christ. We're going to work him back in on this. So you would say the number of prayers you would say had a symbolic meaning, and he's sort of showing you how to do this. He's got all the accoutrements of saying the prayer. Quite often, if you're praying to a specific saint, you would say the number you would say that prayer 12 or 13 times, or possibly 12 times repeating that prayer, and then one Pater Noster or something like that. So that's what we see going on right here with this. Now, St. Anthony is particularly appropriate for this because the story goes that he was the first one to do sort of a pseudo-rosary, even though he was long before they became popular, by using stones to count his prayers in the desert. So using this sort of textual basis to inform a painting that then gets used as a model for your own repetition of those prayers. I'm just going to check how I am on time because I could talk about this all day. Oh, good, we're in good shape. This one's going to be kind of hard for folks to see. We're going to be talking about this arched one in the corner. So if you want to kind of take a look at it, make sure you're somewhere you can see, feel free to go up close and then step back if you prefer. The way the doorway is, it's sort of it can be a little bit of a challenge. What we have here are 2 panels of what would originally have been a 3-panel altarpiece. So there would have been a central panel, and these 2 would have flanked it. They actually would have been reversed so that both figures would have been praying to the centerpiece, but that's not a very stable way to display it. But if you imagine them kind of on the opposite sides, so they'd both be looking in toward the center. The 2 donors are here on the front corners praying. You'll note that we have the female version of the rosary over here in a type we're much more familiar with now. This was a chaplet that was often associated with the Virgin Mary. And then over here on the right, we actually have an 8-string rosary. And this is the first time I'm talking about the number 8, but we'll be coming to it again in a minute. 8 gets associated with the resurrection. And the reason that 8 gets associated with the resurrection is because it takes 7 days for creation, and then there's something that comes after. It's a little bit of a strange leap because creation and Christ don't happen right together in the Christian tradition, but the idea is that it's the next stage. So there's creation, and creation leads to the fall of man and sin, and then you have the redemption from that. So it's sort of the next phase. So you have a lot of rosaries that end up with this pattern of saying 8 of something as hope toward resurrection. So your first few focus on sin and being contrite, repenting for what you've done, and then your 8th bead is the prayer for resurrection and for hope for the future. And so we see that going on here. I'm talking about this at this point because it also brings in several other things that we've already talked about. If you look at the groupings with the man and the woman, we have our odd and even numbers going on. Again, do we know that people would have always known that? No, but it becomes a pattern that is so common, gets repeated so many times when it doesn't have to be used, that we know that they saw it as appropriate. They talk about it in text, and then they also use it in images. So we'll see those groupings. We think this was probably painted sometime after the death of the man, when his wife, when she was a widow, would have entered the convent, and that is why she is dressed as a nun. They are shown here with their patron saints, John the Evangelist on the right, and Saint Barbara on the left. Probably these people would have been named that. Barbara's crown has 7 spikes, and there is a lot of discussion in medieval saintly literature about numerology of names and the number of letters in your name meaning something. And so it's quite possible that that was, again, intentional as a way of reinforcing who it was. But the main reason that we know that this is St. Barbara is that tower behind her. And I was talking before about how architecture is one of the main ways that numerology gets dispersed, repeated, thought about. And Barbara's tower has 3 windows. We look at it and we say, hey, 3 windows, that looks balanced, that looks nice, that's a good number, it looks very even. A medieval person looking at this says, Barbara's story says that what happens to her is that she refuses to marry the pagan guy that her dad picks out for her. Being a respectable father, he can't live with this. He decides that what's going to happen to her is that she's going to be imprisoned in a tower. And he's going to build a special tower for this. If you're getting sort of shades of Rapunzel, I don't think there's something entirely wrong with this. It's supposed to be very tall, single staircase up. But he doesn't want to make her miserable. He loves his daughter, so he talks to her a little bit about the construction. He's planning to have 2 windows. She says, no. I'm a good Christian. I want 3 windows. I need 3 windows so that I can pray on the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it's an essential part of Barbara's story that she have 3 windows, right? So again, we look at it and say, hey, 3 windows. Medieval person looks at it and goes, oh, commitment to faith, right? The 3. And then they're reminded themselves to think about this. So we see these moments here where they see other people praying 8 beads for resurrection, praying the decades, frequently 5 decades at that particular point, with a book of prayers, with this tower to meditate on the Trinity. All of these ways are reinforcing their own practices. So let's see. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually this kind of grouping in the middle, the font that's right, this giant stone thing right here, and then several of the works in the case. So kind of congregate around the middle, but also feel free to move around. The stuff in the case is particularly small. So, take a look. And I'm going to start by talking about this baptismal font, which I'm sure everybody noticed when you came in. It's really, it's really hard not to see. A font is a place where somebody would be baptized into the Christian faith. At the point at which this font was made, that was typically, but not always, babies. There would be reasons for adults to be either rebaptized or baptized, especially if they didn't know whether they had been baptized. And this has a lot of global symbolism to it. By that I mean symbolism about the world and its creation. And that was because being baptized was kind of like being reborn into the Christian world, which was seen as being a global experience. And so they really wanted to emphasize the way that the child became a part of this like endless community. So we have a very spherical basin. They weren't always this way. This is a really intentional choice to make it this deep. When you're just pouring water over a kid's head, you don't need a basin that's this deep. In fact, that's a lot harder to maintain. You have to put water in it, you have to keep it relatively clean. It's gonna be a challenge. The medieval world did know that the earth was a globe, right? It's often talked about as though they didn't. Absolutely knew it was a globe, represented it that way. When we see this kind of half circle, it is often a reference to that. Then we have the four corners. If you've heard about the four corners of the earth, very much a common trope even then. Each of those corners has a head on it. Now, that represented two different things at the same time. The first was that rivers were often represented as people's heads, sometimes with water coming out of their mouths. There was thought to be a stream called the Fountain of Life that had been made in Eden or in Paradise. And from that, there were supposed to be four rivers that flowed out and flooded the entire earth. And that was where all water came from, was this original fountain of life. So by having these four corners, what you end up with is the font itself as a fountain of life. Because baptism was thought to be the way that you guaranteed yourself eternal life, the symbolism becomes really important there. They also were the four evangelists. And the four evangelists were the four writers of the gospel books that make up the story of Christ in the Christian New Testament. And they were thought to have spread the good news to all four corners of the earth. So you get this balance where you have humans spreading the word as though it is the water of life. And that actually is part of the liturgy that kids would have during the baptism, that they would say, that baptizing you in the water and the word. This bell reinforces the same kind of idea. If you get close enough to look on it, you'll see that the four evangelists are actually engraved on it with their names. Again, this idea that everything connected to the church should be a microcosm of the cosmos. That's an odd way to say it, but you get the point. That it should represent in miniature everything about the world. We don't have room to put an entire church in here, even if we had it. But if we had one here, you would see the way that the churches themselves are based on this idea of the sphere and the four edges of the sphere. And so we'll see that throughout. And a lot of the things in this case, including several of these keys, draw on that same idea. I've been talking mostly about Christianity so far, and that was because it just permeated everyday life, but it comes out in more secular ways too. We saw that in that first platter. Keys, right? Keys are an everyday item, but they were highly symbolic. They would be worn on your clothing outside. You didn't hide it in your pocket. You wore it hanging from your belt, just like all the stuff on St. Anthony Abbott's robe. And because they signified control over a space, they often took on some of the imagery of the globe. And so if you look over here, you'll see, particularly the one on this side of the top and the one on that side of the top, have a global thing divided into parts. Sometimes four, for the four fountains we've been talking about. Sometimes 8 or 12 for the winds, and depending on where you were, the number of winds changed. But those would be global imagery. And then the bottom part, the bit that actually gets stuck into the lock, is broken into a number of pieces that often were symbolic. Now, medieval keys, the way they work, the more complicated they are, the less effective they are. They would be more likely to break or distort. So when we see, like there's one down here that has 7 prongs, that gives more the appearance of security than actual security itself. And so when we see that, we know that part of what they're talking about is the symbolism being more important than the actual protectedness of the space inside. So I encourage you to take a closer look at that, because they combine a lot of these kinds of numbers we've been talking about, especially around the globe. Now, I'm going to talk about one more piece, this one right here in the middle. This is a hard one to talk about with a group, so I'm just going to get you started, and then I encourage you to take a really long look at it by yourself or in smaller groups, because it's extremely, extremely detailed. This is an altarpiece that was painted sometime after 1470. The reason we don't know exactly when is because it's a copy of a famous work by Memling, which was painted in the 1460s. We know it was painted as a matrimonial gift for the people whose, if you peek around the sides, you'll see their crests, the family crests for the owners. They were in Bruges, so a very important market town. And what we see is a recreation of the last week of Christ's life. Starting at the top left, we have the procession into Jerusalem. Again, this is where I'm saying there are really tiny things to see, but you can sort of see people on the pathway processing into Jerusalem. We have the Last Supper in the middle of that panel. It proceeds down to show you the arrest. Then it actually jumps up to the top near the center. We see scenes with Pontius Pilate. Then right here in the middle is sort of the priority of this entire work, which is showing the scourging and the humiliation and torture of Christ before he's crucified. So he's being tied to a column and whipped, given the crown of thorns, having his clothes taken away, all of this kind of stuff. Then we come up here, carrying the cross, then tilts back over here for the crucifixion itself, burial, and then we jump down here, getting people out of hell, resurrection, and appearance. So very, very complicated pathway. This is entirely intentional. This is the same moment when mystery plays become very popular, which were recreations of the last week of Christ in civic spaces, a way of transporting Jerusalem to your contemporary life, right? This is not Jerusalem, right? This is really Bruges. But it was replicating the kind of thing people were doing anyway. This is also the period when the stations of the cross start emerging. So that's where people would literally go out and follow a pathway and pray at different spots about the events that are depicted here. The number of events changes as this is figured out, but basically looking at this one, when you look at it, we can see that they're really emphasizing groupings of three. And there are a couple places I'm going to point that out to you, but then I encourage you to look on your own. The first is that we actually have 3 moments of the crucifixion. We're not going to keep it simple. Actually, 2 was the most common, the crucifixion and then what's called the deposition, which is the taking down of the body. Here we have nailing to the cross, the erection of the cross, and people gathered around the foot of it. And then over here we have the deposition. So we've extended that part to give us 3. We also here, we've changed the order so that these can be right on top of each other. What you see is Christ in a red robe 3 times. The only time he appears in a red robe, because he's post-resurrection. And the way this artist has changed that so that those jump right on top of each other. Now, if you're a medieval viewer, the first thing you think is Trinity, right? Christ in 3 persons. Trinity is really supposed to be 3 ideas in one God. The other thing you would think of in this particular context is what's called the Triduum, which is the 3-day period from Maundy Thursday to Easter. This is the most holy, most sacred, and most upsetting part of the entire Christian year at this time. Darkness, crawling on your knees to replications of the cross, covering the altar in thorns and whips, and also doing a whole lot of praying around what were called the metrical relics of Christ. And these were relics being things that connected you to a saint or to Christ. And there was this big push at this point to meditate on those. And that's why these are right in the center here. And it was particularly popular to say, when you look at something, figure out how many times you'd have to multiply that to get to the real thing. So there would be books published that said, and Mary was 5'10", and they weren't using our feet, but they did use a terminology like feet. And he was whipped 67 times, and that you would be intended to meditate on those numbers as you saw these things happening. So we get here a whole bunch of those different ones. I'd also encourage you to look for 7s, for 8s. Again, going back to this idea of the 7 days of Holy Week and the 8th day of the resurrection. So take a look on your own and see if you can figure that out. I'm going to close by saying I've been talking an awful lot about Christianity, right? And that is largely because this collection supports that kind of conversation. Our collection of medieval works is mainly Christian, it's mainly Western European. These kinds of numerical thinking permeated the entire medieval world, and I mean really broadly, right? Over into what's now Iran, over into the Persian area, very far north. We see different versions of it coming out of China through the Silk Roads. We see it coming up out of North Africa. So much broader than what I've given you the introduction to. And with that, questions, comments, ideas? Yeah.
Would you be able to guess what would be in between those two panels?
Yeah, so the question was, what would have been between these two panels when they were originally there? Now, the most common things, and I'm going to give you them in rough order of how common. Enthroned Christ after resurrection. At this point, it's becoming more common to have an enthroned Virgin Mary, especially since probably the woman was the one who commissioned this. So quite likely that would be my guess. And then the third most likely thing would be the saint of whatever church it was in. We don't know for sure whether this was in a parish church or in a very wealthy person's private chapel. It is more likely to be dedicated to a particular saint if it was in a parish church. If it was in their private chapel, they've already got their name saints, so they would probably choose the Virgin Mary or Christ. Yeah.
So in the general question about the artists, these Western European artists who grew up in Catholicism in the Middle Ages, they would have absorbed a lot of this numerology, I assume, and when they're commissioned and somebody said, "Well, I need this and I need that," they would pretty much know what they needed to do. And in terms of process, whether they would create sketches or whatever that process was with their donor or the person that commissioned, I mean, is that what you would expect?
Yeah, and actually we have records of what donors were requesting, and they would say things like, I want it to look kind of like these ones that are over in this church over here, or the one that this friend of mine has, that he brought back from Germany. And the artists themselves were sometimes itinerant and would move around. So we see a lot of transmission of these ideas, both by the artist moving and by the art moving, and definitely treatises. There are a couple of places, there's one right over there where we put quotes on the wall, but this gets talked about in text all the time. And many of these later ones, the ones that are sort of 14th century and later, were at a period when people were getting a whole lot more literate. But there were also ways of transmitting texts. So the plays that I talked about, they're getting performed for free in the town squares. So a lot of the stories are getting transmitted that way. Books of hours were very, very popular, and often people would be able to own at least a simple one. So they get fancier if you were wealthier. But yeah, easy.
Just a quick follow-up then, did a lot of this sort of fade away during the Renaissance? I mean, the great artists of the Renaissance, was numerology, was that still a thing?
I would say they actually use it more. Again, everyone is trying to understand the world, and you use the tools you have. And one thing I didn't really talk about, because none of our art is a great example of it, is what happens with arithmetic at this point, which is that you're getting a whole bunch of treatises, mostly coming through the Arabic world, some coming from places like Constantinople, that are teaching people algebra and teaching them calculation. You have the emergence of much more market-based economies. People are counting more and finding more meaning. In some ways it drives the Reformation, because this is also when things like buying indulgences start becoming more popular, that like this sin is worth this much.
Roman numerals and Arabic numerals. I mean, if you ever tried to see how things were calculated in Roman numerals, don't even look. Yeah, and there is some symbolism that is based on it being Roman numerals instead of Arabic numerals, but we'd have to be here for like 3 hours to talk about that. There's some great books on this topic though, and about how it relates to astronomy. We didn't get into that with the Pleiades, but this is one of the, it's very documented, especially in the text side of things, and then what's interesting to me is the way it comes out in the artistic side. Go ahead.
First question is, can you recommend any novels or fictions, more or less contemporary, that do a good job of capturing the inner psychology or the inner life of the people who, as you've explained it, they would look at this and they would know it means stuff, and they would contemplate on it. In a fictional work, is there a good book where we would see that, more drawn out, like are you familiar with it?
Yeah, so my number one recommendation, and this is everyone who wants to read about the medieval era in an informed and really fun way, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Eco was a medievalist and actually an art historian some of the time, and wrote this amazing mystery novel that is set in the 12th century and talks about real manuscripts as part of that, but also these sorts of ways of thinking about the symbology of the world. There's also an absolutely fantastic movie version. I highly recommend both for very different reasons. Eco was actually involved in the movie as well, and everything that is visually shown to you in that movie is actually medieval, or at least a replica of a specific medieval piece of architecture or manuscript or sculpture. So everything you see in there is A+. I see you smiling. Have you read any of it? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so seconded. Yeah. It's brilliant, right? Yeah, it's not a slog at all. Yeah, and then if you want something else, if you've already done that, I like Dorothy Dunnett. So, yeah. You had a question too?
A lot of the memoir is super flat. Is there a reason why this piece has so much depth?
So two things. Flatness is always a choice. We see exceptions to that through the whole medieval period. So it's a choice of what to prioritize. This is a period in which replication, one of the things that becomes really important is making you feel like something is a part of your life and that it's a part of your experience. So in addition to the way that we see a lot more depth in these spaces, we also see a lot more attention to things like fabrics and differences in architecture, facial expressions, headwear, and that's part of deciding that what you want to prioritize is what's called affect. So the affective response, which is a highly emotional, very embodied sense. There's a lot that's written about this, about the way that particularly in the later medieval Northern Europe, people really wanted to feel what it was like to be tortured, to be in Jerusalem, right? Pilgrimage has really picked up, but most people can't do that themselves, so they do virtual pilgrimage in their mind. And images were seen as a way of getting yourself mentally there. Earlier, it's often more about we're going to use images to show you what something means. More of, I've often called it a diagrammatic approach to the world of saying it's not so much important to show you what things look like, it's important to show you what things are like. Meaning, underlying reality that might not be visible is more important than representing what you see. Go ahead, and then you.
I wonder, was there ever different versions of these codes? Or, in other words, was there ever this process of different sects, different geographical or religious parties or regions, sort of discussing, unifying into one agreed upon appropriate code? Because I know there was this sort of textual process that was sort of happening sort of throughout the medieval era as different churches, different regions came into close contact. So was this reflected in numerology?
I would say that there are points in which certain things become more agreed upon because they're very effective, right? That certain numbers there's more consensus about than others. But no, I would say absolutely there are always competing ideas. Regional versions always matter. There isn't much unification across, you see sort of little sparks of things here and there. And I think that's why knowing the context of something is so important, because often your local immediate needs will outweigh sort of what's being told to you through a central thing. There are things like, popes saying certain things, but especially before widespread printing, it's sort of very gradual transmission over a long period of time.
This is very minor. Forgive me if you did mention it because I don't always hear everything. But what's with the boar?
I didn't mention it. I had to cut so much. I'm so glad you asked. So the story goes that St. Anthony's only companion in the wilderness is a boar, a wild pig. Now, that seems to have come into the story later, after he's associated with disease, because the way that his followers later on both made money and identified themselves was by keeping pigs. Pigs would be donated to them and they would keep them to raise money. Just like a lot of the monks of central France did wine, St. Anthony's followers did pigs. Now, there's a really important reason for that, and it's not the meat. It's pig fat, which was used in a whole lot of medicines for skin ailments. It was one of the most common ingredients, and so the monks were known for creating the medicines that treated skin ailments. But then they sort of backformed this story that says that he had a pig and it was his only companion, his most faithful companion, and it, like, when he gets distracted from prayers, it'll tug at his robes and get him back on track. But yes, so yes. It's a great story. Yeah, go ahead.
Were there any numbers that artists eschewed during this period? Like, it did not use because of the negative significance?
No, I mean, we saw this with 13, right? 13 was unlucky. 7 was sometimes a bad number. There were other bad numbers, but they could always be turned into something good. It's actually very cheerful in a way of, like, all the suffering, well, that's going to get you something good in the end. The bad numbers, they don't have to be bad. Now, every number, again, this is part of, I think, the code of it, and the way that cracking the code works is that, you know, the same number in a different context is bad or good or has multiple meanings. There's some that just get used less because they have a harder time getting meaning attached to them, but doesn't seem to be a problem. Yeah. Go ahead.
How did you figure out it was St. Lucy?
Sorry, what was that?
How did you figure out it was St. Lucy?
Ah, yes, the St. Lucy story. This is before I got here, I should say. So this isn't me. But when this painting came into the collection, which I have forgotten the year it came in, but someone who is close enough to the label to read what its collection number is, I can tell you that. Maybe Roz can help out here.
Collection number is, I think, 5327.
53 is the important one there. By the way, secret fact about the museum, not so secret fact. The first part of those numbers you see on the wall, it'll either start with a 2-digit number or sometimes M and a 4-digit number. That is the year that the work came into the collection. So 1950s, this comes into the collection. And it doesn't have that platter with the eyes on it. There's something else painted on her hand. And it was something that made it so that she was seen as being associated with St. Cecilia, who's the patron saint of music. During conservation, they figured out that paint wasn't original. There was a huge discussion of, should we remove this? Can we remove this? When was that actually put on? This is something that happens in museums a whole lot, where you have to decide, is it more true to the work to have it as it originally was? Sometimes in a damaged form, right? We didn't know at that point whether it was overpainted because it was damaged or not. So should you remove it and risk having a damaged work of art? Should you respect that that's part of the story of the object? We think it was repainted fairly early based on what was used for the paint, probably only maybe 200 years after it was originally painted. Tastes change, right? Certain saints go into and out of style. You don't throw away your whole painting, you repaint it. Sometimes it's because it got damaged. A lot of these things would have been touched, right? Especially the parts of them that were meaningful, the symbolic parts. There are a lot of places where you'll see that people touched them while they prayed. So it was quite likely that it was damaged. We got really lucky, it wasn't, and we were able to recover that, but it's a hard decision. I'm happy to hang out here, so if you have questions you'd rather ask me one-on-one or you want to look at details, please do. If you haven't been in Remix next door, you can see one of our most recent medieval acquisitions, which is this beautiful little book reliquary. Go check it out, see if you can see any numbers in it, and check out the rest of the collection. And I'll see you around and enjoy your time here.